Hello, I'm Andrew Purvis. I'm the General Manager for the Europe, Middle East and Africa region at the Global CCS Institute. I'd like to give a big welcome to our webinar today, to our international audience. We have attendees online from all around the globe. The Global CCS Institute recently commissioned Societe Generale to take the pulse of the international finance community to determine the awareness, understanding and appetite for financing CCS projects with debt. Today's webinar will present the findings of this exercise and will discuss key issues for financial institutions in the CCS sector, potentially available sources of finance for projects and how this liquidity might be unlocked. I'd like to kick off by introducing you to our presenter today, Mr. Allan Baker. Allan Baker is the Managing Director, Global Head of Power Advisory and Project Finance at Societe Generale. Allan's worked at Societe Generale for 6 years and has been involved in the wider power sector for more than 25 years, initially as an engineer and then later in finance. Certainly in recent years he's become a leading figure in the CCS area, having been instrumental in bringing the financial perspective to the policy debate based on his experience of advising on two of the world's largest carbon capture and storage projects. Allan has a BSc Honours in Mechanical Engineering, an MBA. He is a Fellow of the Institution of Mechanical Engineers, and he is also a Chartered Engineer. As we go through the webinar today, all attendees are welcome to submit questions. You can do this throughout the presentation using the Questions tab on the GoToWebinar control panel, which should be visible on your screen. The questions we get will be moderated and then will be posed at the end of the presentation. Please be aware that we may not be able to get through all of the questions today. However, we'll do our best to get through as many of the questions as possible as we can in this session. And again, you can submit your questions at any time during the presentation. You don't need to wait until the end. And so, without further ado, let me hand over to our presenter, Allan Baker.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, and thanks for the introduction, Andy. What I wanted today was to run through the findings of the piece of work that we completed for the Global Institute of Carbon Capture and Storage. It was a very interesting process, and I think shone quite a lot of light on the approach of the financial institutions to CCS and the change in the perception of CCS within those institutions. What I wanted to do first was to provide some background on how we approached the exercise, to look at some of the financing challenges that CCS faces within the finance community, and then move on to what makes a project financeable and how does CCS measure up against this currently. We also thought it would be interesting to look at other sectors of the power industry where we've been financing relatively new technology or new areas, to see whether there are any lessons that can be learned for CCS from these areas, and then move on finally to what financial support we think is going to be available for CCS and how the banks will approach the sector and how CCS projects should approach the finance community. So moving on first to some background. In our view, financing is going to be essential to the development of CCS, and that's not only in terms of rolling out of the industry, but in terms of the demonstration projects as well, because we believe part of the demonstration should also be demonstrating that the CCS projects or the CCS industry can raise finance and demonstrating the structures on which that may be done in terms of risk allocation. Up to now, we've seen a number of large-scale demonstrations projects moving through the system, including particularly in the US and Canada, that these have been financed in the public sector. And the risk allocation, the commercial structures of those projects, we don't think are always in a bankable form. They're moving in the right direction, but maybe not bankable. And the other running thread through CCS so far has been that the financial sector have not really engaged with CCS They see it as being somewhat experimental, expensive, and some way off in the distance as far as business opportunity goes. So approaching this exercise, we actually started with a comprehensive review of the information that was available in terms of financing. We spoke to a number of projects to see what approaches they'd made to the finance community, or even if they considered commercial financing. And then went into an extensive engagement exercise with commercial banks, ECAs, multilaterals, and others that we thought would be involved in the industry going forward. In this exercise, we spoke to approximately 20 financial institutions, commercial and investment banks. We spoke to a number of the world's major ECAs and to around 8 multilaterals around the world. So we tried to be as all-encompassing and as geographically diverse as possible with the sounding. We focused on their understanding and perception of CCS and tried to tease out of them issues that they had with CCS at this stage in the development process. The objectives were to, as I say, to understand really where CCS was within the financial community, whether it was gaining ground, whether it was still seen as experimental, whether there was any interest, to understand some of the challenges faced by the demonstration projects that are looking to access external commercial financing, and understand what would be needed to reach financial close for a large-scale demonstration project. So quite an ambitious. We believe, and we think comes out from this study, as we'll see in more detail later, is that the commercial challenges, in a sense, could be more significant than the technical challenges for the early projects raising debt. This may prove not to be the case, but certainly our experience and the feedback we've got initially is that the commercial side of CCS is very challenging for the finance community. So looking first at the challenges, and one of the feelings that we've had over the past few years and is still present today is that with a lack of industry and a lack of precedent, there's a lack of interest from financial institutions. This is very simplistic and may not now be the case with everybody, but it's still the underlying theme that goes through the conversations with banks. But we believe that's changing, which is positive for the industry. The first point we came across was familiarity, and the perception of a lot of the financial institutions we spoke to is that there are no CCS projects in operation. This perception is driven somewhat by the press, somewhat by the sectors that the institutions focus on, but also the fact, I think, that they haven't really engaged with CCS. They haven't taken the time to look around and see what's actually going on in the industry. What they see is the coverage from the press, which is somewhat negative and can give the wrong perception of the industry. And I've just taken 2 quotes here from the press at various times. Cost sank long Gannet. This reinforces in the bank's mind that CCS is expensive, that it's not viable. And then Vattenfall ditches research into CCS. Taken out of context, this could look like one of the companies that's been heavily involved in CCS is actually no longer interested if you're not within the industry. So perception is a key issue. Familiarity with the industry is needed to see through these headlines. If you just compare with one quote related to the oil and gas industry, this shows you the difference in the press coverage of the industry. This is from some time ago, but it's a much more positive headline to be seen if you're a financial institution. Not that offshore wind is without its issues, and this is just coming from a slightly different direction. Precedent is always important to banks, and here we've seen that their perception is that the technology is new, it's novel, it's innovative. If you're within the industry, and I'm from the finance industry, but with an engineering background, I can see that many of the components of the industry are used elsewhere, or have in fact been proven or are being proven. So again, this is a perception. It's something which we need to get over with the financial institutions, and we'll look at how we do that later. Integration, clearly an issue for the banks. They're not used to dealing with these, or at least on the power and the industrial side, not used to dealing with complex, interdependent chains. This is more frequent in the oil and gas industry, and maybe we need to engage somewhat with the oil and gas teams of the banks to bring in some understanding of how this integration may pan out. And the same is true of storage risk. This is really outside of the comfort zone of many of the banks that look at project finance, but is well within the understanding and the comfort area of, for example, a reserve-based lending team, which many of the banks will have, but not necessarily speak to in relation to carbon capture projects. And then the risk allocation and the cost base. These are two areas which will only be defined by engaging with the banks on commercial projects. So that there are two issues that are vital to deal with going forward. The other aspect that came up during the discussions when we were telling people there were CCS projects in operation, part of the reason we felt they weren't aware was that a lot of the demonstration projects they're now looking at are based on the power sector, whereas a lot of the precedent has been related to gas processing and other areas of industry where these banks are maybe not so familiar, haven't followed the market, and are not aware of what's going on. So there may be a disconnect here in the information flow about what projects the finance community are actually seeing. The other aspect of this is that many of those projects haven't actually been externally financed. They've maybe been financed through balance sheets or by debt raised for other major projects, and the CCS component was a side effect, a side line which the banks didn't really see or pick out. So overall, some perception issues to be dealt with. The clarity of the structure is also important, and what is CCS? I think there's confusion about what CCS actually means. If you speak to an American institution, CCS is actually CCUS, with the emphasis on use, and the industry there is being driven by the use of CO2 to establish infrastructure. So they've got established pipelines, collection, transportation. They've got an established market for CO2 with a traded price for CO2 and contractual precedent on how you contract to sell that CO2 to the enhanced oil recovery industry. In Europe, by contrast, the emphasis has been on storage. There isn't, at the moment, so much opportunity for carbon use. So it brings a different set of problems. We have no pre-existing infrastructure, so it has to be built. Pipelines, storage facilities all need to be built as part of a CCS project. No pre-existing EOR industry, as I say, as an anchor customer or buyer for CO2. But we do have in Europe vast offshore storage potential in the North Sea and other areas, which is a huge asset for Europe. But if you look at the two areas and compare and contrast, the US appears to be lower cost, lower risk because there's existing infrastructure that you can sell into, and lower commercial barriers to entry because you've got an existing industry on which to base the CCS industry. Europe, by contrast, higher cost, higher risk because you need to develop the full chain, and the CO2 in Europe at the moment is a liability rather than an asset, which is a very big difference between Europe and the US. This has policy implications, and banks focus very heavily on policy. CO2 being seen as a valuable commodity in the US, and it's predicted there'll be a shortage of CO2 in the US for enhanced oil recovery going forward, is a very different situation from policy setting than having CO2 as a liability. And again, EOR makes policy more of an add-on to an existing industry in terms of making sure that CO2 stays in the ground and measuring that, rather than establishing a whole regulatory framework to make sure that you store and contain CO2 in the storage site. So very different policy implications. And from a financing perspective, this is causing the confusion, I think, that the different approaches to CCS, different technologies, different regulatory frameworks, and different environments makes it very difficult for financial institutions to pin down what CCS actually is for them. So just to take a step back and look at slightly higher level and what makes a project financeable, these issues are the same, or these points are the same for financing in whatever sector that you're looking at. And they're quite high level, quite generalistic, but quite interesting from a CCS perspective. The first is policy and regulatory support. We are always looking in financial community for clear policy, clear regulatory support. And this is even more so when in Europe at the moment, CCS requires heavy subsidy for early deployment and it's a long life asset, we need to be sure that regulatory support, tariff support is going to be there over the life of the capital investment. And technology, banks are not very good at taking first-of-a-kind risk or in analyzing first-of-a-kind risk. One of the key aspects of this is that they'll try to push that risk into as many other places as possible, which makes it difficult in the early projects to do the risk allocation in a commercially acceptable way, which takes us on to risk allocation. Project finance, the community are very good at analyzing risk. They can do that fairly well. They can allocate risk, but some risks can't be taken at any price, and that's important for CCS. We believe there may be some risks in the early projects that the finance community will not be prepared to take, and that the commercial sponsors of these transactions may also find it difficult to take, and we'll come on to that in a while as well. And then opportunity. Different institutions have different drivers, but one-off projects, it's fair to say, are not usually good targets for the banks. It takes time to analyze those projects, and they're looking really for deal flow. So looking for follow-on projects, they're looking for clients who are going to be involved in the industry going forward, and they're looking for the development of the industry in a way which they can engage with and be part of over the longer term. One thing to bear in mind as well is that developing a new sector like CCS is actually an investment for a financial institution. It takes a lot of investment in terms of time, in terms of resource, in terms of internal capital within a bank or an ECA or a multilateral to say that we want to focus on this institution, do the groundwork we need to get involved and to be part of this industry. So in the back of your mind, if you're looking at developing CCS, it ought to be a consideration that you need to show an industry, you need to show development for banks to actually get involved. So how does CCS measure up against this? Well, on policy regulatory support, we're seeing some divergence, but we're seeing at least in some areas where there's a willingness, a desire to actually develop the industry and create a regulatory framework which supports the industry, particularly the early development projects. And an example there I'd give, I'm sitting in London at the moment, but an example for me would be the UK, where they've taken a conscious decision to fund 2 development projects, or up to 2 development projects, with £1 billion of financing and an ongoing tariff support to cover the operating costs of CCS. So that's a very positive situation. In other countries, it's been maybe less positive, with people either saying that CCS isn't on the radar or is not at the moment being considered, but that's very important for banks. Technology, as I said, technology is always a focus of the financial institutions. They've been burned on a number of technology changes, like in terms of gas turbines, for example. As the development of gas turbines proceeded, there were a number of financings of machines that didn't work as expected, so technology is a very keen focus. But there is now a growing base of information available on CCS-related technologies, sometimes in direct applications for CCS, sometimes in other applications, but that information is being drawn together, and banks are becoming much more aware of that resource base now, and something which they need for their comfort. The one point here as well, as I made earlier on, was that CCS in many cases combines the chemical industry, the power industry, the oil and gas industry. And this is a challenge for financial institutions because usually they're split into industry teams. So you'll find that a commercial bank, for example, will have a power team, they'll have an oil and gas team, they'll have a reserve-based lending team, they'll have an industrial and finance team, usually sitting separately, sometimes together, but often not integrating their skill sets on projects because it's not required. So CCS, for us, is an opportunity for them to use that wider skill set in combination to understand the industry in greater detail. But nonetheless, you need to bring that to many people's attention, because if the power team looks at this, they're likely to look at it as a power project. If it's a CCS power project, they may not think to go and involve their oil and gas specialists in reservoir or storage risk. Risk allocation, it's going to be run through the whole theme of the industry. The ultimate concern of banks that we found was that they were concerned about white elephant risk. What happens to a CCS plant if it's built as a CCS plant, can't run as any other project, so it can't run in a market as a standard power project, for example, or a chemical plant, because either regulatory reasons prevent it doing so or technical reasons prevent it doing so. The bank's security, if they make a loan against the project, is wiped out completely or largely if that project's sitting idle over its life. So that's the major concern that came out of the risk allocation. And I think one of the lessons from other areas is that the early projects are going to require a bespoke risk structure. And the key target, if you like, from the development projects that engage with commercial banks is to establish that structure, which can then be used on other projects with less pain and become more of a standard template for allocation across the industry and how to deal with some of those risks which at the moment we're struggling with. And then opportunity. This one I've put a thumbs up sign next to it, and it may sound unusual when the industry is seeing quite a lot of projects dropping away. But I think in our view, when you look at the Global Institute's annual reports, which covers the projects that are either in commissioning or in operation or taking financial investment decisions, the reduction in the number of projects in that analysis to us signifies a hardening of the projects. The focus is now on projects that have much more likelihood of going ahead, that are much more commercially underpinned, and the finance community as well is starting to pick that up. Seeing that list with maybe 20 projects joining, 20 projects falling away each year, but 60, 70, 80 projects on that list, just gives the impression that the projects never reach anywhere. Now we're seeing some tangible progress, and banks have started to see CCS as a real opportunity. So there is progress, and 3 years ago we would have probably given, as Societe Generale, we would have probably given thumbs down to all 4 of these, but I think now we're moving in the right direction, and we see some really tangible progress in all areas, which could lead to, we think, to financing of development projects. One thing we thought might be interesting was to look at an analogous industry to see whether there were any lessons we could learn for CCS to try and short-circuit the process and create the sort of framework we need to get things moving. The one area we focused on in this was offshore wind, because in many ways this is not dissimilar from carbon capture in the sense that it was an industry which had some precedent onshore. The technology had some grounding onshore, but going offshore was a number of firsts, or represented a number of firsts, not least using foundation designs from the oil and gas industry to prop up turbines, marinizing the turbines to make sure they could withstand the offshore rigor, so changing the technology, adapting the technology for a particular application. And the area is also completely new for financial institutions, so for, basically a clean sheet of paper. The key things, again this is important for CCS, the key things which drove the development of offshore wind in the finance sector was a strong policy support, particularly some targets, tangible targets in Europe for the amount of capacity they wanted to develop. There was a clear subsidy regime in many areas in Europe, so in Germany, in Belgium, France now, in the UK, for developing the offshore wind industry. The and some very large developers, very credible developers getting involved in the industry to drive it forward. And going back to risk allocation, with one thing here being that there was no completion risk on the very early projects. So those projects weren't financed until after the completion because of the bank's concerns about offshore construction and completion risk. Financing has been successfully mobilized for the industry. We started very small. There were a handful of us financial institutions involved in the industry at the beginning, maybe 7 or 8. There are now over 20, maybe 30 banks that are willing to look at offshore wind financing. And deal size has gone from $100 million, $200 million to over $1 billion. We've seen several deals recently at over $1 billion of debt raised for offshore wind. If we can get to that situation for CCS in the near future, that'll be a very positive step. But we need to take the first step down the road. looking at this chart, the key takeaways from here at this point are really that by 2013, we've seen almost $12 billion of debt committed by financial institutions of various kinds to the offshore wind market for around 18 gigawatts of capacity. And that's starting from around 2004, 2005, when the banks got seriously involved in the industry. So there can be substantial growth once financial institutions are engaged, once they're comfortable with an industry. It's possible to grow something very quickly. And just looking at the breakdown of the institutions that are involved in offshore wind at the moment, this is quite important as well. Maybe not easy to see the graphic, but the yellow bar and the light blue bars are equity and commercial lenders, respectively, and the red I-beam is the ECA involvement. So these are ECA guaranteed facilities, supporting equipment supply into the industry. If you look at the early transactions, you'll see that mostly commercial banks and equity with the ECAs have been involved in putting those together. Later, as the facility size has got larger, and in general terms, the facilities are larger as you go right. Yeah, you've seen the emergence of players such as EIB, taking the dark blue, taking a very significant part in the industry to help those debt facilities. You've seen the grey bar public finance institutions, public banks like KfW, for example, coming in as well to provide support. And recently Green Investment Bank in the UK and other green funds into the industry as well. So as those facilities have grown in size, it's been necessary to pull more liquidity into the industry. But that liquidity has been available as the industry has developed, as people have got more comfortable. So there's a growth story there. But one of the other key facts to look at here is that it took around 5 years from the real start of the offshore wind industry in 2000, 2001, in terms of development, to attract significant funding from commercial banks into the industry. So from a 2001 start, we saw the first commercial financings of any scale coming in 2005, 2006. So there is that lag, and that lag was really driven by the development of the early projects, the gaining of familiarity of the financial institutions with the risks associated with the industry, and the time internally it took to establish with credit committees the agreement to go ahead with that industry. So there's a timing issue here, and it's one thing we're concerned about with CCS is to try and shorten that timing period, to get banks involved early, to make them CCS ready when the development projects actually need, or demonstration projects actually need their funding in place. And we found also that there were a number of banks who were willing on offshore wind to be early movers in the industry. As I say, there were 5, 6, or maybe 7 banks who financed those early projects, who were ready to finance. And it's crucial that CCS identifies those banks or those institutions and gets them into the industry early to have a springboard to really develop fast. And again, coming back to risk, which runs through everything, the early projects have had very early, very conservative risk structures, which banks were able to bank or to finance off. This is just a single slide to try and pull together some of the feedback we had on around the risk. And the table is interesting in trying to divide risk into areas where the banks were not at all comfortable, where they felt they wouldn't be able to take risk, areas where there were risks but they thought they might be able to get around it, and the unusual one at the end is we don't know what we don't know. It's a very early industry, so there are a number of banks who hadn't really thought through the risk allocation, who hadn't really understood the CCS risks that they may be facing. So that there's the key things though that come out of this is there's clear interest now in CCS developing. We undertook an exercise maybe 2.5 years ago of bringing a group of banks around the table to discuss with industry the financing potential, and almost all those banks that came along to that meeting had not really even focused on risk, had not really focused on the industry. Now people are starting to think through the risks and have been able to divide them into these categories, even if they haven't done the detailed due diligence to really understand the risks. And the key thing here, though, is to just bear in mind that interest doesn't necessarily equate to understanding. And once we've drilled down into some of these risks, it's clear that whilst banks have got a superficial understanding, or ECAs and other institutions have a superficial understanding, very few of them have done the detailed due diligence really to understand those risks in detail, which they will need to do at some time. And because of that, I think mobilizing finance is going to require all the stakeholders to be involved in that education process so that enough information will be provided to the people who need it to make informed decisions and to keep them engaged in the process. But banks are starting to think about this, and the engagement we've had on a number of projects, it suggests that they're willing now to drill down into those risks and fully understand. So our view is that there's an open door now for CCS. It was maybe ajar, even closed before, but we need to focus on keeping the momentum in the industry. And success breeds success. We saw that in offshore wind, that one successful financing attracted banks into the industry because they could see that there was something there for them. And we see the same happening in CCS, hopefully. So just moving on quickly, and appreciating time, will financial institutions support CCS? We think they will. We think the financing is likely to come from a number of different sources. First and foremost, I think, from the commercial banks, the project finance community. This is a huge pool of global liquidity. There are over $400 billion of funding, it was over $400 billion of funding provided for more than 1,000 transactions globally in 2013 in the energy sector. So there's a huge pool of liquidity out there. There's a huge resource of very well-informed industry. If we can provide that opportunity. The ECAs, we think, will also be crucial in the early transactions. And we've seen a significant interest in those, driven in part by supporting some of the industrial champions that are involved now in the sector. So, players like players that are providing technology have been speaking very closely to ECAs because they can provide guarantees and direct funding. And these ECAs are now spending time on CCS, understanding the industry. Multilaterals and public finance institutions, again, have been very, very active now in trying to understand what the opportunity is in CCS. And we've seen an active dialogue between people like EIB, for example, and a number of CCS projects in Europe. And EIB have been running as well the NER 300 process. So they've got a very keen understanding of the industry, but others around the world are similarly very engaged because they see this as an opportunity to make a real difference in clean energy generation, which is by and large one of their strategic objectives. Going back to the chart we saw earlier, just to reiterate, you can see the role that each of these areas has played in the offshore wind industry. And if you've got a billion or a $1.5 billion financing, and you can find an ECA that's willing to take 20-30% of that in terms of a guaranteed facility, or having EIB coming with 10 or 15% of that funding, it makes the funding easier to complete if you can engage with each of those components and put each of those components together in the financing. And in CCS, in many cases, for demonstration projects, we're moving from the very small scale projects now to billion-dollar projects straight away without the intervening step of moving through 100, 200, 300 million dollar projects. So raising that financing, engaging with those people is going to be crucial. We looked also, just very briefly, at other areas of potential finance. Capital markets being one, because we've seen a lot of capital markets activity in the US, for example, where the industry is involved in things like transmission lines, in LNG export facilities. Recently, we've seen very heavy engagement from capital markets in those areas. But they have been reluctant to take new technology risk, and CCS was seen as something which was a bit outside of their scope at the moment, I think, but there was interest there nonetheless. One area, one tool to bring those lenders in is through guarantee of credit enhancement schemes. And we looked at a number of those, including the Infrastructure UK guarantee from the UK government, which may be applicable to CCS, and the EU 2020 bond guarantee scheme, which is an incentive scheme to try and underpin some of the risk to make transactions more attractive to the capital markets. The most recent example there, which is relevant for CCS, I think, was Castor gas storage. Gas storage being quite similar to the storage risk that of CO2. So there may be some precedent there which could be useful for financing some parts of the chain. But refinancing may be the scope, or maybe the area where CCS becomes more interesting. So just very briefly on this, just go through the steps that financial institutions will follow. You've got identification. Financial institutions need to actually see the opportunity. You have the education process, where they need to undertake their own due diligence. They need to understand the transactions. They need to understand the sector and prepare a business case for inclusion in their strategy, and educate internally. As I say, it's an investment for a financial institution. They need to educate internally to make sure that people then buy into the sector, and they can get management support for dedicating resource to following on with these projects. In principle, support to lend and getting principal support to lend to the sector, and then finally execution. So understanding and fully supporting this process is essential for outside institutions, as I said, for companies. So working in practice, I just put together a simplistic flow diagram of following this process through. And you no need to go through this in too much detail, but our perception is the best place to start is with technical education. Tell people about the technology, prove that much of it is already proven, and demonstrate that it's a scale-up rather than being new technology, get people comfortable with technology, and then move into the commercial education process once the commercial structures start to get established. And then as you go through the process, you narrow down into a feedback assessment, a feedback loop to do the commercial structuring and end up with a financing. In practical terms, what that means is the process is likely to be very iterative compared to a normal financing process where shareholders can generally come out with a term sheet with a fairly cooked transaction and expect banks to understand the transaction and to bid against the transaction. This is going to be much more iterative. The bank's feedback needs to be taken into account all along the route. And that means close cooperation with potential lenders, understanding their needs and in telling the lenders, what risks they need to take, or seeing what risks they can take and what risks can be laid off. And just to bear in mind that this is an untested process, so there's a need to be pragmatic during this process, to take time to provide the information that's required and to make sure that people are not left behind during the process. In the report, if you read the report, you'll find that we looked at a number of projects, I think it was, projects that were looking for commercial finance at the moment. The most advanced of these, I think, is Texas Clean Energy, which will be familiar to many people. But this is a project that's been talking to lenders for quite some time. They've been involved with the commercial lenders in the US, with the ECAs, the Department of Energy and so forth, that are moving more towards a Chinese financing solution, partly due to the cost of Chinese EPC, Chinese equipment, but also the availability of funding through Chinese ECAs linked to that Chinese involvement. So an interesting solution. It'd be interesting to see how that pans out, but very different, I think, from how the general industry will progress. The second one is White Rose, and this project is one of the projects been selected for FEED funding by the UK government, but on the basis that they will be raising fund community. So it's a very iterative process involving the UK government in the funding process, and the UK government taking a keen interest in the engagement with banks. But this project is currently engaged with over 20 financial institutions, ECAs and multilaterals included, and are following a very similar path to the one we laid out earlier in terms of how that engagement is running. So finally, just the conclusion, just to wrap up so there's time for questions. Probably the key things here are that there is now the emergence of some tangible projects on which the banks can start structuring debt, and this seems to me to be the trigger for the industry to move forward. It's been very difficult up to now to talk in general terms or theoretical terms about whether or not the project might be financeable. So now the industry is becoming very interested because there's something tangible to hang their hat on, something they'll be able to take to credit and say, this is a project, this is the risk allocation, these are the sponsors, it's a real project. And in the US particularly, there is the availability now of very firm revenue streams you can contract from the polygen projects, revenue streams which support CCS effectively. In the UK that's coming, or in the UK and Europe, that's going to come from tariff support, from regulatory frameworks. But nonetheless, there is now in place a mechanism to deliver revenue to CCS, which is again crucial in developing the bank's interest. And the policy, it can't be underestimated how much of an impact, for example, the UK government making £1 billion of funding available to CCS has had, but also supported not just by grant funding, but by the ongoing support that will come through the contract for difference mechanism. And we're aware that a number of other governments are looking at similar mechanisms to try and stimulate CCS. So I think with that, I'll leave it there. But just to say that the CCS for us, and on the basis of our exercise, is moving to, or from the too difficult box, where we thought it was 2-3 years ago, into the potentially interesting box. But if we want to keep it in potentially interesting and make it definitely interesting, we need to maintain the momentum in the industry and not just see 1 or 2 demonstration projects in the US and Canada, but a whole series of projects developed to develop the credentials we need to drive the industry forward. So with that, thank you very much, and if there are any questions, I'll be happy to take those.
Thank you, Alan, for your presentation. As I said before the presentation, which is on the page. However, a number of questions have come in through the presentation, so we'll kick off with those. Maybe to begin with, I'll just clarify that this webinar is being recorded, and the slides and discussion and voiceovers will be made available on the Institute's website in the next few days. The report this website is based on is also, that this webinar is based on, is also available on the Institute's website. Alan, how many export credit agencies have restrictions on the provision of finance for new coal-fired power stations? And does this also apply to CCS technology?
So it's a very good question, actually, and we've looked into it in much detail recently. It actually is not a problem just for ECAs, it's a problem across the piece. A number of commercial banks have either a very stringent policy, or indeed in some cases they're not lending at all to coal-fired power plants. But what we have found is when we've been to speak to various agencies, various institutions, CCS is often exempted from those policies as clean technology, clean generation technology. So we don't think that's going to be a constraint on financing the industry in the end, as long as we can demonstrate that there is significant capture and that that CO2 is sequestered permanently.
Can you reflect on how the cost of capital rate for CCS is likely to develop and how this will compare with offshore wind?
I think what we will see, and well, if we go back to offshore wind, or go to offshore wind to start with, what we have seen there is that for the early projects, as I said, the financial institutions are quite risk averse. So if you go back to the chart that I showed of the different projects, you'll find that initially projects were financed, for example, on around 50-50 debt to equity. So there's a high use of expensive equity in those structures. We've seen that move now to the more recent projects where it's 70-30, 75-25, so there's a saving there. But also in terms of the bank pricing of those transactions, we've seen that coming down fairly significantly as people have become familiar with the different risks in the industry. And I think we could see the same thing happening within CCS as long as we get a number of transactions built and we get some deal flow. If it's a series of one-off transactions using different technology, it's very difficult to get those improvements in cost of capital. But I'd refer people as well to, there was a piece of work done for the UK government, the UK CCS Cost Reduction Task Force. There was a report published last year, and it's on the Department of Energy website, which highlighted cost of capital, if you like, or financing cost as one of the most significant potential reductions that's seen the industry develop. Some of that came from savings in contingencies. Obviously, if you build first-of-a-kind plants, there are contingencies layered on top of contingencies, and as you build the second, third, fourth one, that you can get much more confident in the pricing. And that's one of the positive things, I think, from Kemper County, is that whilst the cost may have been higher than expected, Kemper 2, if you like, if there is a Kemper 2, you can imagine that the contingency would need to be less.
Alan, we have 2 power projects to be operational within 2014-15. How many operational large-scale CCS projects in the power sector do you think we need to give confidence to financiers to enter this market? And perhaps as a follow-up, how long do we need to get the operational aspects of these projects understood enough to be bankable?
I think the answer is usually maybe just one or two projects actually in the ground and operating. Because one of the key concerns, as I said, of banks is firstly white elephant risk. So if you can show that this technology is working somewhere, then that risk goes away. If you can show that the integrated chain is working as you'd expect it to, if you're capturing the amount of carbon, technology is working, then the risk greatly reduces and potential lenders become much more comfortable. But the issue again here is consistency. So if you demonstrate an IGCC, if you demonstrate oxycombustion, you need the second oxycombustion plant will be where you get the benefit of that, or the second IGCC, and that's why it's important for the industry to move ahead and develop a number of these projects. You won't get maybe the benefit from the learning on an IGCC if you're trying to translate that to an amine post-combustion capture plant, which is why we're keen to see demonstration plants in each of the technologies, and then people can choose the technology that works best for them. But we don't believe you need to wait for a sort of 3-year period to prove that a technology works, unless there are problems. If there are problems, obviously, clearly banks will wait for those to be resolved and before they want to move forward on a commercial basis.
How valuable are loan guarantee programs like the Department of Energy's Loan Programs Office?
Sorry, I didn't hear that, Andy.
So how valuable are loan guarantee programs from governments such as the Department of Energy's Loan Programs Office scheme?
Oh, no, they're very important. And, we've seen, if you look at the loan guarantees, if you look at the ECA support, if you look at the UK grant funding, if you take grant funding in particular and to a certain extent loan guarantees, if you've got grant funding, if you've got loan guarantees, it reduces the amount of commercial uncovered debt you need. And it's the commercial uncovered debt which is the challenge. It's difficult to get ECAs to get involved. They go through their own risk process. But the commercial banks are the most difficult entity to bring into this, I think. So particularly in the case of grants, if you've got grant funding, they can change the perception of debt to equity on a transaction significantly. If you've got DOE loan guarantees, they can make a huge difference to the willingness of it's difficult to put a figure on it, but obviously if you've got a loan guarantee, your risk allocation, your pricing, everything changes materially. So it reduces cost of capital as well for the transaction, or reduces ultimately the cost to the consumer of financing these projects.
Would in projects in being bankable, or is it a regional issue?
No, it's not at all regional. If you can show people an operating project anywhere, if you're using similar technology, if there are, if the similarities are great enough between the two projects, it doesn't matter whether the project's in the US, Canada, whether it's in Germany translating to the UK, it's very much a global business, and many of the teams looking at this are global teams, so they will have the capability to look at something in one jurisdiction and apply those lessons. One of the key things here is the information that's available, though. So if it's a different developer, for example, to get the benefit, we need to have the information available. So we need to be able to look inside and see how those projects are performing to get, for our due diligence providers, for our engineers and so forth, to give us the comfort that they are actually operating well, that we can worry less about technology. But then any project built anywhere, I think, is a positive as far as raising finance goes. For example, I mean, there was the Vattenfall Schwarze Pampa test site, and it's very useful to be able to take people, so it was until decommissioned, to be able to take people there and show them that there was a fairly large-scale demonstration. It wasn't a desktop demonstration of those burners and the oxy-combustion process. It's a fairly significant investment being made improving those burners. So, and small things like that, and definitely completed projects make a very big difference to the confidence in the finance community.
How do banks take account of non-technical risks in issues such as public acceptance or sort of policy surety? It's becoming increasingly important, and there was a question about coal and coal policy earlier on, and that's an example where banks are very conscious of their duties in terms of the environment. Many have public shareholders as well, so those issues now are increasingly important, not just for CCS, not just for coal, but for any transaction that the banks are involved in. So the public acceptance, public engagement is a crucial part of our due diligence when we're looking at transactions, whether it's a pipeline, a refinery, the power plant. And clearly in the case of CCS, there have been some examples where that wasn't managed very well, or it was managed quite simplistically, and it proved to be a problem. So we're acutely aware that this is a crucial piece of the CCS jigsaw. Perhaps to close out, Allan, do you think that by 2020 we'll see financial institutions being more significant players in CCS projects?
I hope so. I genuinely do. I think that as I said, with a number of the projects, I think there is a chance now for the finance community to be involved. TCP is one in the States. It may be in the end the Chinese financing, but certainly the premise of White Rose, if that project goes ahead with the UK government, is for that to demonstrate financing as well as need to have banks stand up comfortable with this technology. Otherwise, there's a risk, and we've seen a lot of developments. And I think it was somebody mentioned recently at a conference, we've seen a lot of development of renewables around the world, and increasingly offshore wind in Asia as well now. And if we're too late getting the industry on a glide path, or CCS isn't so needed as part of the energy mix. I personally think it will be going forward. I think it's crucial. But politically, we need to show that external debt can be raised for the industry, so that politicians have the confidence to actually invest their tariff support, if you like, in CCS as well as the offshore wind industry.
Thank you, Allan. Unfortunately, we weren't able to get through all of the questions we had in the time we've allowed. However, if you do still have any questions, please submit them to the Institute through our webinar inbox, which is webinar@globalccsinstitute.com. Webinar globalccsinstitute.com. The webinar today has been recorded, so if you came in late, you can listen to it again on our website. It will be posted there in the next few days, along with a copy of our presentation today. Finally, as you're leaving the session today, we've put together a very quick 3-question survey, and we'd really appreciate it if you could take the time to complete it. It's really to help us improve our webinar program going forward. I certainly hope that you found this webinar valuable, and once again, thank you to Allan Baker for presenting. Thank you all for your attendance, and goodbye.